Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. This is Dan Turchin, CEO of Insight Finder, Executive Chairman of PeopleRain, and host of AI and the Future of Work. Now, every week on this podcast, we talk to technologists, executives, investors, and entrepreneurs about their visions for the future of work. Rarely do we have guests who span pretty much all of those. Michael Shepard's a distinguished engineer at Dell Technologies focused on AI research. His work has been widely recognized for inspiring many projects within and beyond Dell that use AI to make people better. Now, we've talked in the past about 3 attributes of responsible AI. I personally believe all AI vendors will soon be required to publish, call them AI health reports, in the not too distant future that will confirm any AI used to automate decisions that impact consumers will be A, transparent. That is, when an AI is used to make a decision, it will be incumbent on the vendor to make it clear that that AI was used to automate that decision. B, AI will be predictable. That is, the inputs used to generate models will be used in a consistent way, and the same inputs will reliably produce the same decisions. And C, all AI will be configurable. That is, the parameters will be able to be tuned to adjust outputs when decisions are deemed to either be biased or inaccurate. Today, we're going to get a little bit of perspective, not just on what is responsible AI, but also how Michael and Dell Technologies approach AI research that informs strategies and roadmaps for an organization with more than 100,000 global employees that is truly looked to as a leader. And some of these decisions and the projects are truly going to help define what work looks like for, call it the next billion employees. I've been excited about having Michael on this podcast since we first met. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Michael Shepard, distinguished AI engineer at Dell Technologies. Michael, welcome to the show. For starters, tell us about your day job.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and just share some thoughts and exchange some insight with you. So as far as my day job, so I've been at Dell 20 years now. A little over 20 years, and been in multiple different departments throughout my journey here at Dell, from strategy to procurement, supply chain, advanced analytics, and now leading the AI research, as you mentioned. So I'd say, from a day-to-day perspective, what do I do on a day-to-day process through the progress of my day? I would say it starts with learning, right? So a lot of people, I've stressed over the last few years that the speed at which the world is moving is increasing at such an accelerated rate that if that's not a predominant part of, I guess, maybe your data feed or your news feed on your phone, understanding how technology is changing, you're going to be getting behind. So staying on top of the latest tech trends, shifts in emergent technologies, talking with other tech leaders, interfacing with our CTO and our technical leadership community. And then as I've traveled, obviously not much or at all this year, but the conferences around the globe, talking with tech leaders and stuff. So that's kind of the primary thing that I do. The other thing that I have to do on a pretty regular basis is evangelizing any of the technologies, whether it's AI or whatever we're working on in research, evangelizing that to teams and executives, help them to see where the future is going. So take that knowledge, what we've learned, what we understand about what the future looks like, and educate internally so we can drive kind of constant change. And then talking with customers in our executive briefing centers, explaining to them kind of where Dell is at as a technology leader, how we can help them. And then finally, probably the least, or probably some of the most intriguing part is getting to directly impact and drive within our own research team and across other teams in Dell, the specific, I guess, projects that I feel like we need to be working on to get ahead, stay ahead, and make sure we're a leader in this industry across the board. So,
how'd you get excited about AI?
It was pretty natural evolution for me. So I mentioned that I started in strategy. I was in the manufacturing diagnostics and the enterprise space. And what I very quickly realized is it was hard to think strategically when you didn't have the information you needed to know what strategically needed to change. So it kind of started with that needing more data, getting more data, which led into big data and the promise of big data, which for many people turned into a big data swamp versus a big data, something of value. And for many years worked on something we talked about as big data, along with big data, was analytics at the speed of thought. So as analytics at the speed of thought evolved, eventually I began to realize that no matter whether the system can help you produce insights every 5 seconds or every 3 seconds or every 1 second, it doesn't matter when you've got a billion variables to look at, right? We started looking at the complexity of that. And so that's when machine learning, I would say maybe 5 years ago, began to become apparent that that was going to have to be a predominant part of our decisions for the future. So that journey was, naturally took me into AI. So yeah, that's a big part of how we got to where I'm at today.
So I've read up, and you and I've talked about some of your higher profile research projects, hardware optimization, system diagnostics, potentially collecting data from every Dell laptop that subscribes to a certain kind of service. Tell us about the project that A, you're most proud of, and then B, that you think will have the greatest impact on how we work.
This evolves obviously over time as we learn and go through this journey ourselves. There's different aspects that I find need more focus. So right now, I really have been heavily focused on graph. And when you think about it, I've realized that in the same way that AI is attempting to replicate the way the human brain works when you think about neural networks and stuff. But the reality is we tend to think socially. We tend to think relationally. We think about how is this connected to that? What is the connecting factor? And we ask questions in that manner. And the reality is as we've gone from big data into, or a lot of people have moved into this big data space, they're realizing that they have all the data, but they don't know how to connect them. So I actually created a slide about a year ago talking about how we needed to make the data silos disappear. So within research right now, we're heavily focused on this unified data foundation that whether you're a data scientist or a business intelligence person or just an executive that has a question about how two things intersect or what's going to happen in the future, our research on eliminating those data silos, not from a functional perspective, not necessarily saying, hey, we're getting rid of this Oracle database or Teradata or SQL, but it's more that intersecting and interlocking domain of where you can create a graph that can allow a person from a single point of view to come in, single API endpoint, to get to anything they need to get to. So to me, that's one of the things I think will make the biggest impact moving forward on how productive Dell can be and other companies will be able to be is laying that foundation.
These days you can't read a blog or look at your email without encountering some kind of overhyped, often dystopian vision of the future based on where AI is headed. You got a big audience right now who's learning about AI and where it's actually headed. What do you think is the most misunderstood idea about how AI is used today?
Again, it depends on what level technically, how technical somebody is and how much they're in this domain, right? Everybody's at a different level. I think in general, though, the common person, the average person, the person that isn't into technology on a day-to-day basis doesn't really recognize the depth and level to which AI is already integrated into their entire life, right? I had a conversation not that long ago with a person that's an electrical engineer, and it never occurred to him that, which electrical engineering is my background as well, that when you're doing voice to text, when you're talking to Google, when you're talking to Alexa, it's literally this sound wave coming out of your mouth, going into, from a sine wave into a square wave, converted into zeros and ones, trained into a sequence of zeros and ones to letters, And so that never occurred to him that is just the foundation of AI. It's pervasive throughout our lives, whether using Google Maps or Waze or looking at the weather. I mean, you make a decision almost every day. People look at the weather, basically using a mathematical model to determine whether something's going to happen tomorrow, and then they make a change in their decision and what they do in their lives. So AI, I think that's the biggest thing that's misunderstood, is AI is not some futuristic thing. It is, especially from a narrow intelligence standpoint of a specific use case, it is very pervasive throughout their life already.
I always give the examples of Amazon shopping recommendations or Netflix movie recommendations.
Yep.
Nobody thinks of those as being, Skynet, Terminator age, bot apocalypse kind of use cases. And yeah,
Yep.
so to your point, they are ubiquitous. The biggest impediment to broader adoption of AI is data hygiene. I should say data access, data wrangling, data hygiene. It sounds like you described the work you're doing on graphs and that sort of thing. I suspect it's also a challenge in your lab environment. Talk us through how you think about the challenge of wrangling data to be able to provide the right inputs into AI models.
Yeah, so I would say, we raced forward on big data. We then jumped into AI, and now we're backtracking in many ways back into, as we begin to realize that data wrangling is such a massive effort. Now, I refer to it as graph, but in general, it's more about rebuilding a unified data foundation. Across the world, you have all these IoT devices. You've got billions of devices coming online, but there's no unified standard. And what ends up happening is you find that there's major data quality issues. So it is a huge impediment to the speed at which we can move forward and our ability to accurately predict things, because that, the average, I believe, is about 80% of time that a data scientist spends is just access to the data, finding the SME that can tell them what the data means. I mean, all of those domains are encompassed into this idea of basically, we're attempting to take the whiteboard, wipe it clean, start back at the source and say, why does it matter whether the JSON format is the same for this data element? What if everybody just conformed to like a schema that everybody agreed to? I mean, they did this back in the 90s when you had AGP and EISA, and it all came down to PCI Express, right? You had a single standard of communicating to the CPU. And that same concept for data, I think, is going to be a core component of this unified data foundation that cleans up and accelerates what we can do in every other space. So, we've already in many ways addressed the problem. Those, we always talk about the V's, the velocity, veracity, volume, all those things around big data. Many of those have been addressed. But now we have the data silos and the non-uniform data aspect. So it's a huge impediment, absolutely. And the data hygiene, actually, when you begin to unify and bring this together, we actually find that the hygiene of the data improves because so many people get access to it. In fact, I would say don't wait for it to be clean to expose it to the end users. We found that by exposing it, the end users pointed out all the problems, and that accelerated our ability to clean the data. So it's kind of reversed. People think, oh, it has to be perfect before we expose it. It's like, no, let the users play with that, and they'll tell you what's bad. So that actually, it was an insight that we got through a lot of our data or analytics at the speed of thought program.
I saw you on stage a few weeks ago. I guess it was a virtual stage at the Dell Global Partner Summit, talking about kind of the future of AI really being a fusion of human and machine intelligence. One of the things that I would love for more people out there to appreciate that really is the near and possibly even the mid and the long-term future of AI. With that thinking in mind, that kind of augmentation of human intelligence, what do you think is one thing that will be commonplace at work, call it in 3 to 5 years, that today might seem bizarre or just like science fiction?
I've always advocated for AI, the A in AI, to be augmented, right? Augmented intelligence versus artificial. I mean, technically, we don't really even have AI right now, right? It's all machine intelligence. It's incorporated into a specific domain. So augmented intelligence to me is a much better use of the, I guess, use of AI. But I would say that probably one of the most important things in the future is going to be this shift in how we access information. Will no longer be that we need to learn the content. We need to know how to ask the right question to get to the content. And in fact, I had a really good discussion, I think it was about 4 years ago, with a guy named Mike Rulin up in North Carolina. He, in the medical industry, has run hospitals and stuff, and he's talking about the knowledge is accelerating in the medical industry so fast that you can't ever expect a doctor to keep up with that. And so training doctors and nurses and stuff in the future is really going to be, when you think about the job of the future, is more, do you know how to ask the right question to get to that data? So that's, I think it's going to be important for us to think about our jobs in that context, not necessarily needing to know the details of everything, but needing to know how to get to the information that is stored somewhere that an AI system can actually direct us to. So I think that's one interesting, change that one thing that we need to anticipate in the next 5 years. Another one that I think was kind of intriguing that I've talked about and actually done an article about is, imagine not having to plug your devices in anymore, the intelligence. We went from local area networks with a cord to wireless, which, back early 90s, the idea of having a wireless network connection seemed for, and now we've gone to magnetic, circular magnetic pulsing for something on top of a device. But with the Zenic wave and some of the other things coming, long range wireless power, I think it's very possible that within 5 years, imagine never having to plug your laptop in. What would that do in terms of your digital device if you didn't have to carry a massive battery around in every device? So
every company at this point is starting to think digital first. And in our daily interactions with CIOs, CTOs, every every CEO and every board is asking, quote, what's our AI strategy? When you get CXOs asking you, where should they get started? When the CEO or the board asks them that, what's a pragmatic way that you coach execs to get started?
Due to the learning curve that we've come through and what we've experienced on our journey, I would definitely say get the data scientists involved in your data engineering. What we're finding is, and I've written a little blurb on designing AI projects for failure, and what the intention of that title is really to make people think about, are you designing what you think is your next generation platform, but not realizing that the way you're designing it is old school thinking, and therefore it's not going to be able to produce the ROI that you're expecting because you haven't considered all the nuances to the data structures and the data engineering components. And so one of our data scientists, Landon Chambers, had a great little LinkedIn post about making sure that the data scientists are involved in your data engineering discussions and decisions, because they'll give a different perspective than what traditional data engineering has thought about. So to me, rather than just saying, hey, immediately jump into this one domain like machine learning or deep learning or the techniques, it's more around the orchestration and architecture of the overall system, making sure you're addressing those foundations so that 3-4 years down the road, you don't come back and go, wow, I wish I would have done it back in the beginning.
I want to go back to, you referred to narrow artificial intelligence and that as kind of juxtaposed to general artificial intelligence. I think it'd be useful to get your definition of narrow versus general, and then polish your crystal ball. Talk us through when you think we'll achieve something that we broadly consider as general artificial intelligence.
I'll hit the second part last because that's a bit of a loaded question, but the narrow we absolutely are doing today, right? There's many use cases where we're seeing benefits, especially in the medical device industry and in entire domains. We're seeing it in supply chain optimization. There's a ton of projects that we've deployed inside of Dell where we're using narrow AI for that project. So narrow to me is just simply, maybe let me go back to an analogy that I've used in the past. When you go to you have this perception that, hey, this is AI, it should be able to tell me anything. But the reality is when you go to a doctor, you go to a different doctor depending on their specialty. Are they a pediatric doctor? Are they one that deals with brain surgery? We don't have this expectation that one doctor, you go to one doctor and it can handle, that doctor has the knowledge of every single medical domain. We already have a narrow expectation for that doctor. Now, yes, as a human, you could ask that doctor for some financial advice, maybe good, maybe bad, but you're probably going to go to your financial advisor. Also, that doctor can maybe get in a car, can get in the car and drive you home. So an AI isn't necessarily going to be able to be autonomous driving plus give you advice and medical advice and financial advice. Narrow AI to me is maybe, really is that. It's really good at, you give it a specific task and can it outperform that specific task. So detecting, the big one that DeepMind released the study on is detecting when breast cancer metastasizes. They were just showing that there was a very low probability of the doctors getting that right. Their models demonstrated that they could hit high 90s in their accuracy. So general AI is more that ability to do a number of very different sets of tasks, more generalized across. The AI can help you with all these different things, can be a part of driving, can be multiple different tasks. As far as when we'll hit general AI, I've seen everything, predictions from never to I think the earliest I've seen is about 25 years. I'm always shocked at the rate and speed at which we're moving. I think there's going to be some appearance of AI passing the Turing test, not in a narrow domain, but in a generalized way, probably within 25 years. I don't know that I would necessarily call it full artificial general intelligence, though, AGI. But I do think you're going to see some of the the Turing test, not being able to differentiate if it's the AI or a human. I think that's definitely achievable within 25 years. So
I'm still taking the over on that one. That sounds ambitious.
The AGI in 25 years?
25, yeah.
Yeah, it depends on which aspect. If you're thinking, I still wonder if we'll ever achieve true, like being able to do anything and everything a human can. But I think in terms of like a question and answer ecosystem, like having a conversation and not being able to tell pretty much any domain, you could ask any question about any domain and have that knowledge assimilated. I think we're accelerating into that. You're seeing, these leapfrogs with BERT and some of these GPL or GPT-3 and stuff like that are showing how much data you can encompass into a corpus of knowledge already. And some of these, and I'll go back, maybe to defend that point of view, I would say look at some of the instances that have popped up recently, like MIT did the time capsule that they predicted could not be broken until I think it was like 2030. I was at MIT lab, and then one person by himself actually broke it, right? And it's like, here we are 7 to 10 years early, and they're getting breakthroughs, and a lot of it I think comes to the fact that we have this crowdsourcing. You're able to assimilate knowledge from the entire embodiment. The whole world can contribute through open source capabilities, and I think that is causing this exponential leap. And there's both in the technology. So the AI is also able to help design the chips, right, to improve on the capabilities in the silicon design process. And then those improvements are helping us to do things today, like some of the models we couldn't run 3 years ago, or if we did run them, it took them weeks to run, are now running in a matter of minutes. And the same thing, you're seeing these leapfrogs. It's like two different domains that are capitalizing on each other. That's creating this accelerated curve that we've never seen in any other domain of technology in history. So,
in your defense, I think we consistently underestimate what progress can be made in a decade and overestimate what progress can be made in a year.
Right.
Now, I know a topic that you and I are both passionate about is the ethics of AI.
Yep.
And I know you recently spoke at an event at UT Austin. Would love to get a little bit of insight into some of the kinds of topics that came up at that conference.
Yeah, the predominant discussions were more around how to make sure that you don't have bias in your models. So if you think about like who does or does not get a loan, things like that, so the bias aspects of making sure that there's equality in the model, there's like an ethical model in terms of equality of that space. So there's quite a bit of discussion around that. The piece that I was focused on a little bit more in my session and in the panel discussion was more broadly around, what do we consider to be ethical for AI? Because, for the past, for thousands of years, theologians and philosophers have debated a lot of these questions, and now, companies like Facebook and others have been thrown right to the forefront as the spearhead to go make decisions on, even in the last election cycle, what did they prevent from being released on Twitter, or what do they, what is one group of folks will say, well, that wasn't ethical, another one will say it is. So I think there's more work that needs to be done in terms of making sure that ethics are properly defined, and then making sure that we're having discussions and creating an environment where people of different mindsets can contribute their view back into your models. I think that's the piece that's missing, and what I had kind of focused on is, as we get into explainable, and you touched on this earlier in this discussion, was explainable AI. The explainability is key. But as you find out what's explainable, what about, who's monitoring the output of those dimensions? Is there something skewing in one direction or another? And so I think that's a piece that's very necessary. Another one in ethics is trying to understand, should you or should you not create a model that advances your company but might negatively impact the personal life of an individual? That's a very difficult discussion, because you absolutely can move your bottom line forward, and the shareholders in many ways demand it. But then ethically, if you know that it may have a negative effect on somebody, then should you do that? And so there again, back to this comment, one of my favorite presentations I ever saw, Mike Rulin from the medical device industry gave a great presentation, and his title was "Just Because You Can Doesn't Mean You Should." And he was talking about his personal experience with his dad, and what they did medically to help him live longer, but not necessarily have a better quality of life through the end of life. And he said, just because we could do it doesn't mean we should have. I think AI very much in ethics needs that perspective. Just because you can do this does not mean you should. So I think that's a perspective, and something, within Dell, we have this thought leadership and this discussion and thought around, should we even be doing this? What are we doing? Just making sure it's forefront, right at the forefront of our discussions and our thought process as we build models and implement stuff, to help us.
The UN has been talking about having all of its member nations sign a pact that will prevent AI from operating with any kind of lethal force.
Yep.
Certainly seems like the right direction for humanity. It's a little bit daunting knowing that we're having that conversation.
It absolutely is. Yep.
Now, Michael, we got to wrap up in a minute, but I've got to get in this one last question. I'm dying to get your feedback on this one. So we hear a lot about Google's parent company, Alphabet, and the moonshot projects that they're engaged in. Would love to hear about anything that you can share publicly, anything that you'd consider kind of moonshot-like, of which I'd consider chargerless or batteryless laptops in that category. But what's one thing that you think could have that kind of moonshot quality to it that you're working on?
Well, as you probably know, we part of Dell's primary goal is creating technologies that drive human progress, right? And we actually have, if you look at Dell's 2030, we call it Progress Made Real goal. So it's not just, how do we take that and make it real? And the goal of that is really to advance, health, education, economic opportunities, and just deliver really long-lasting, enduring results for 1 billion people by 2030. I mean, that's the tangible. We achieved our 2020 goals. We actually started on the 2030. I would say maybe a little bit early. But from a research perspective, when you look that far out, I would say that there's plenty of projects that we're working on, but the ones that we're working on that I think will help eliminate divides, right? Divides across countries, languages, things like where you can speak in one language and they hear it in theirs. I mean, there's projects like that AI is enabling, eliminating some of the political, social boundaries. It's hard to know what we're working on today that will actually trickle down and help establish some of both the ethical concerns and also, have the biggest impact by 2030. So I really do think as I work with one of my friends works on that team for the 2030 goals, and we talk pretty regularly. And I am always feeding him ideas, and he's coming back to me with what they're seeing. And I think it's a great way for us to continue to make sure that our models, anytime we see synergy between what we're designing and how it could impact, like funding small farm loans in the middle of Africa, things like that, ways in which we can enable that and make that more seamless and help them grow and transform from a third world to a second world country, second to first world, those sort of projects. I think that's where we're going to see the biggest impact long term. It's actually what I get excited about when we work together with it.
Likewise, I love that vision, and it's okay. Maybe we'll have you back when some of this stuff becomes a reality. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that'd be great. I appreciate it.
Good stuff. Well, Michael, we're out of time, but this has been really fun. I feel like we're just getting started, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in the future.
Well, thanks for having me.
This is Dan Turchin, host of AI and the Future of Work, saying thanks again to Michael Shepard, and thanks to everyone for listening. We are back next week with a fascinating conversation with a fascinating guest.